Welcome back to Buckeye Talk. It's a Market Down Monday. Doug Lamarice, Nathan Baird, Stephen Means. We're doing tackles. Not that exciting, Nathan. Are tackles exciting? Are tackles even worth talking about? Do tackles matter?
Well, if you never tackled anybody, you give up a touchdown on every play. So sure, tackles matter.
Look at you with the football knowledge. Right off the jump.
How does hard-hitting analysis. Whenever someone says, oh, he made a touchdown-saving tackle, I'm the guy that's like, they're all touchdown-saving tackles.
Are you really that guy? I'm
not in a serious way, no.
I was going to say, that's such a party pooper thing to say. It's like, okay, we know that, but you know what we meant.
Yeah, that's good. I'm conflicted on this because there was a time, right, when it's like, hey, leading tackler. It was like, okay, especially at a place like Ohio State. Like anyone that has great linebackers, like, oh, leading tacklers. Like that's a Spielman kind of category. That's a Randy Gradishar kind of category, right? Like, let's talk about Ryan Shazier. Let's talk about leading tacklers. Let's talk about AJ Hawk. I don't know, Stephen, like if it feels like that anymore. And sometimes we have so many conversations. We've already done sacks, who will be the sack leader on Market Down Monday. And then we get into situations where do sacks matter anymore, right? Mm-hmm. You got pressure. You forced the quarterback to throw the ball earlier than he wanted to. You did your job. Did you maybe not get there? That's okay. It's such an offensive game. And there is often such a bend, don't break mentality. And sometimes against the very best offenses, if you can force like 3 or 4 punts in a game, you are changing the game and doing your job, even if you're giving up 31 points. I don't know what to make of tackles sometimes, because sometimes it's a guy who's flying all over the field. Sometimes a leading tackler tells you something about how a defense was bad. Sometimes it's just the guy in a spot catching people when they get to him. How do you view tackles?
If you're in the middle of the field, you should probably be up there in tackles. So linebackers, safeties. Everybody, if somebody else is leading the team in tackles, they were either really, really crazy good or something went very wrong. If like a cornerback is leading your team in tackles. But it's also, it's not quite as bad as it was in the 60s in terms of everything was a tackle. But a lot of times it's just, you gang tackle so much now that it's hard to say, it's hard to put so much value on one person having a lot of tackles, because they might have a lot of tackles because they have like 80 assistant tackles and 40 solo tackles. Does that make them an elite linebacker or safety or tackler? No, it just means they play a position that's religiously around the ball anyway.
I think this might become a Tommy Eichenberg conversation. And the thing that is interesting about this is that when you look back through the last several years, it's like, hey, I was just looking at the Big Ten tackle leaders. And it's like, hey, there's the Ohio State guy. He's 24th in the Big Ten in tackles, because the other teams had to face Ohio State and make a bunch of tackles. And Ohio State's defense wasn't on the field that much because their offense was on the field so often. And then they spread it out. They put backups in. And it's hard for an Ohio State individual sometimes to move up that list, Nathan. Sometimes you know the types. Iowa guys have a bunch of tackles. Wisconsin guys have a bunch of tackles. Sometimes like, Northwestern guy has a bunch of tackles. It's like, wow, is that Northwestern guy an All-American? It's like, no, the Northwestern defense was on the field for 50 minutes every game. Somebody had to do it. So that guy had 150 tackles. But then you look at Tommy Eichenberg last year, Nathan, and he's tied for second in the Big Ten in tackles with Cal Haladay of Michigan State. Jack Campbell, the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year, was first with 128. That's 120 tackles for Tommy Eichenberg, and they felt real. And it almost felt like Tommy Eichenberg was playing like an Iowa linebacker or a Wisconsin linebacker or a Northwestern linebacker or, a Michigan State linebacker or one of those guys who's racking up stats, who's always around the ball, except he also was doing it for a playoff team in a really important way that made him a second-team All-American. So I feel like this might turn into a Tommy Eichenberg podcast, which I think is good, because we probably need to have a Tommy Eichenberg podcast. Because I think one of the things that we want to figure out this year, we did 10 things I'd like to figure out from this Ohio State season. On the list somewhere is, how good is Tommy Eichenberg? And I think we have moved. We don't use the TB word anymore in relationship to Tommy Eichenberg. That's been vanquished.
He's PW.
He's closer to PW. And again, is he treading tiptoeing. He'll never get there, but tiptoeing down James Laurinaitis Lane, right? That like it's again, he was in the Tough Borland cul-de-sac for a while, and he moved. And he's not ever going to buy a house on James Laurinaitis Lane because you got to be a 3-time All-American, and Tommy Eichenberg would have to be 30 to be a 3-time All-American at Ohio State. But he might be in the neighborhood more so. So what, like, if Tommy Eichenberg comes out again, Nathan, and is just everywhere, constantly tackling people, incredibly reliable, incredibly on the attack, explosive, in backfields, tracking down running backs, not just catching guys. He's going to build something here, Nathan. He's going to leave something here. I think the Tommy Eichenberg legacy project is a really interesting sideshow to this Ohio State season.
I think this podcast is a Tommy Eichenberg conversation. Before that, it's a Malcolm Rodriguez conversation. And to go back to the guy who was in the middle of Jim Knowles' Oklahoma State defense for several years. And really beyond that, though, it's what you were already hinting at. And I know that Wisconsin and Iowa typically take it on the chin a little bit when they play Ohio State's offense. But numbers-wise, you can look at them year in and year out. Those are great defenses. And I think across college football, they always rank highly among all the defenses of college football. And the sign of any healthy defense, and I mean not physically healthy, but healthy schematically and healthy in terms of execution and responsibilities, is a linebacker doing this, right? Like, even in the modern game of college football, I think this is where your tackles are supposed to pile up. If you have a safety leading you in tackles, something has probably gone wrong, unless you have a very a defense that's even more safety driven than what Jim Knowles is doing. So I think some of this is Tommy Eichenberg coming into his own last year and stepping up and getting past some of he had some health issues, I think, in 2021 when he lost that job to Cody Simon, and Cody Simon played well too, and then Cody Simon had the health issues, but stepping up at the right moment, being the right person for Jim Knowles, but then also benefiting from a healthy step that defense took. And if it takes another one in 2023, which we have reason to think it might, I think that just means another, like you're saying, another big year for him, and he gets to be, in a lot of ways, the face of a potential defensive turnaround if that happens.
Do you think Tommy Eichenberg, Stephen, has a chance to go down as an all-timer? That maybe not in the top tier. Maybe not when we're making the linebacker Mount Rushmore and we're doing Laurinaitis and Spielman and Gradishar and Shazier and Hawk and the names that everybody knows, right? There's a lot. There's a lot. But maybe the next group, or maybe at least if we're having a conversation of 15, 20 guys, somebody goes, hey, you know who was a heck of a player? That Tommy Eichenberg. Can he get there if he has like another year like he had in 2022?
Possibly. And I think him being an Ohio kid probably helps with that, because that always. But he's hard, because I'm glad you brought up Malcolm Rodriguez. I think I asked Jim Knowles about that during the season, because is it him or is it the system? And the NFL draft might tell us some of that. But also, Malcolm Rodriguez was a 6th-round pick who also just ended up being an impact player for the Lions. So was Malcolm Rodriguez underdrafted? And yes. Because Malcolm Rodriguez, yeah. So, but because if you're thinking about them in the same mindset, and you see what Malcolm Rodriguez is doing, does that mean Tommy, as the new version of that, is a 3rd-round pick instead of maybe a 7th-round pick?
And I made that comparison, and I think it's apt in some ways, but there are some differences. Rodriguez was a converted safety. Dane Brugler, I think, had like a 4th, 5th round grade on Rodriguez when he went in the 6th round, so it wasn't like he was massively underdrafted, but I think people thought that the Lions got a steal, and that held up. I think the answer, though, could be both. I mean, I think it could be that, yes, this system, and then this system executed well, is going to feed a lot of tackles into the middle linebacker. But I think it's also true that Tommy Eichenberg, as Malcolm Rodriguez had, intelligence and a vision on the field and a studiousness and a preparation and sort of a facility at playing that position that is uncommon. and he is able to maximize what he's supposed to do in that defense. He's a guy that doesn't feel like he's out of position almost ever. He's a guy that doesn't feel overmatched by very many situations he finds himself in. There have been a couple times where he's gotten matched up in some passing situations that were tough for him, but that I don't think they were his fault. It's something beyond steadiness. As far as whether or not he could just be an all-time great, I think if Ohio State wins a national championship this year, and people attribute that in part to this defense re-arriving, then I think his name will get floated alongside some of those other guys. That's a tough list to crack, though, man. When you start talking about Laurinaitis and AJ Hawk, I mean, these are like some of the most beloved players, and that built over several years in a way that I don't know it's quite gonna do for Tommy. But I think you're right. That next subset down, he would be in that conversation.
Well, I don't know. I mean, from the Rose Bowl on, he's been kind of headed towards this trajectory. So it will have been multiple years, and he's kind of in the same vein. Like, this is not a kid who, if Cody Simon had done the last 2 years what Tommy Eichenberg had done, I think we'd be viewing him differently, because that's a top 100 recruit who's doing top 100 recruit stuff once he finally blossomed. Tommy Eichenberg being outside the top 300, kind of being a throw-in the 2019 class, at least from perception, and turning into this is why we still haven't wrapped our heads around the fact that he's doing this completely. But really, it's very similar to, like, AJ Hawk wasn't highly recruited like that. He just turned into AJ Hawk. So maybe he might, if he has another season like this and is like a first-team All-American, maybe we do throw him into that tier.
But also football has changed a little bit too, and you had to have great linebackers, I think, in the Hawk Laurinaitis era in a way that maybe you don't have to have now, and that also feeds into the identity that those guys had.
I do think it can matter when a coach is establishing something. And there's a guy that is leaping to mind for me. And I think if Jim Knowles winds up being a long timer here at Ohio State, if we're 15 years from now and Jim Knowles is still the defensive coordinator and is now one of the most iconic assistant coaches in Ohio State history, which I think has a chance to happen. I don't think if this goes well, I think he might retire here. I mean, Larry Johnson had a whole long career at Penn State before he got here, and he's approaching a decade here. So, like, that idea, could Jim Knowles be here a decade plus? I think that's very possible. When you're a foundational player for a coach, you go down in sort of a legendary way because that coach brings you up all the time. Thad Matta, when he got here, like, brought up Jaquel Foster all the time, right? That was a guy, he was on that first Thad Matta team, and he's sort of a foundational guy. He establishes a way of doing things that then permeates the program, and he gets after it, and that shows the next group of guys who shows the next group of guys, and this becomes the Thad Matta way of playing basketball. There's a guy defensively who was that for Urban Meyer, and Urban Meyer talked about him all the time, and he was a foundational guy. Urban Meyer inherited him. He was a Jim Tressel recruit, and it's John Simon. And I think Tommy Eichenberg, now, if you said John Simon, is John Simon Chase Young and Cam Hayward and the Bosa brothers and guys like that? Mike Vrabel? No. Do people look back on John Simon fondly? I bet you, I guarantee it. Maybe it's you right now listening. Somebody listening, when I said the name John Simon, went, oh, John Simon. Because you know why? Because you love John Simon. John Simon limped out on senior day, right? John Simon is like, and Urban said, like, what's my program? What's my Ohio State program look like? It looks like John Simon. I think there's a chance, Nathan, Jim Knowles, 8-10 years from now, when it's like, hey, Jim, and he says, my defense looks like Tommy Eichenberg. And that would contribute if he winds up being back-to-back tackle leader, back-to-back first, second team All Big Ten, first, second team All American, the guy that Jim Knowles brought the most out of, which we've talked about, but also comes to exemplify what the Jim Knowles defense at Ohio State should be. And now, hey, Tommy Eichenberg's back in the building. Oh, my gosh, hey, Jim Knowles. I think that's on the table. It might already be set. Maybe that's what he could break all of his thumbs. He could have thumb replacement surgery and break them and not play another snap this season. No, I don't want to say that. Aliens could abduct his thumbs. We don't like to talk about injuries. My thumbs. Wouldn't it be funny if there was like an alien beam came down and just a thumb They just took his thumbs right off and just right up to the spacecraft. Thumbless Tommy Eichenberg can't play. He still might be that. But if he does it back-to-back years for Jim Knowles, Nathan, he has a chance to be a foundational part of the Jim Knowles legacy at Ohio State, which has a chance to be a pretty good legacy if he sticks around.
I think at the end of the day, that will be the more interesting debate here is if we skip right past who's going to lead in tackles and go to how many tackles would Tommy Eichenberg have if he played a season with no thumbs? Like literally no thumbs.
85.
He played every game.
85.
The wounds had cauterized by the time the season started. He can play on opening day, and he doesn't have to leave for any other reasons. Normal usage. What percentage of the tackles he would have had otherwise with two thumbs?
Yeah,
that would be. We'll save that for another. We still got a little ways before the season comes. I think it's. I think it's.
Anybody out there who doesn't have their thumbs, ow. We apologize.
Ow. No, it's inspirational. It's inspirational.
No. He wouldn't say ow. No, first of all, he's not saying ow. He's going, ugh.
To answer Doug's question. Within the Jim Knowles defense, because we talked in so many ways about all the things that make up the Jim Knowles defense, and he calls it a safety-driven defense, and there's the jack, and there's all these little gimmicky things within it, and he's the mad scientist. But maybe the Jim Knowles defense at its best, like I was saying before, maybe this is just true of all defenses. Like they're really only going to work if you've got a guy in the middle of it who knows where he's supposed to be, who knows what the opponent is going to do and is ready for it, and is just this tackling machine in the middle of it. And I think that is something that it doesn't necessarily come down to talent as we conventionally describe it, or there's certainly not elite talent as we conventionally describe it. It's more about just optimum reliability. And that was what Malcolm Rodriguez was for him at Oklahoma State. And you didn't call him Malcolm Rodriguez because, again, I think they're different kinds of athletes. But it was from the first conversations we had with him where he first mentioned Tommy Eichenberg's name in January of 2022 to the conversations he was having with you, Doug, and other people at the gaggle that we had in May or early June, whenever that was. Like, he's talking about the same things. He's talking about just a guy who gets it, who sees it, who recognizes it, who processes football in the middle of everything else that's going on, and is the stability around which everything else can operate.
Tommy Eichenberg was second in the Big Ten in tackles last season with 120, led Ohio State. Ronnie Hickman led Ohio State in tackles in 2021 with 98. He was 10th in the Big Ten. That's a safety leading Ohio State in tackles. 2020, Pete Werner had 54 tackles to lead Ohio State as a linebacker. He was 17th in the Big Ten. 2019, Malik Harrison as a linebacker led him with 75. He was 27th in the Big Ten, and he was Ohio State's leading tackler for an excellent Ohio State defense in 2019, which is why these tackle stats sometimes can get goofy. 2018, Malik Harrison and Jordan Fuller tied for the team lead with 81. They were tied for 24th in the Big Ten in tackles. That's a safety and a linebacker leading. 2017, the great Jerome Baker, victim of Bill Davis. 72 tackles, 32nd in the Big Ten. He leads Ohio State in tackles. Jerome Baker. 2016 and 2015, it's Raekwon McMillan, both over 100. That's the last time Ohio State had a tackle guy over 100. Tommy Eichenberg was the first since Raekwon McMillan. 102 in 2016 was 9th in the Big Ten. 119 in 2015 was 4th in the Big Ten. 2014, now college football analyst, Joshua Perry, 2nd in the Big Ten, 124 tackles. That's the thing. Joshua Perry, very fine college football analyst, snappy dresser, leading tackler for a national championship team. It's 3 things you want to be. 2013, Ryan stinking Shazier. 144 tackles. Led the Big Ten. Ryan Shazier. 2012, Ryan Shazier, 114, was 3rd in the Big Ten. 2011, weird year, C.J. Barnett, now back around the team as that player liaison. Great guy, 75 tackles, 34th in the Big Ten as a safety. 2010, Brian Roll. Who loves some Brian Roll? I love some Brian Roll. 76 tackles, was 21st in the Big Ten. So more often than not, it's a linebacker. But Stephen, as we lay that out there, we can say like, oh, whatever, tackles don't matter. I don't know, counting tackles are crazy. That's so weird. And then we get to Ryan Shazier with 144 tackles, and I have steam coming out of my ears. He leads the Big Ten, and all of that feels real to me. And by the way, Jack Campbell at Iowa leading the Big Ten in tackles last year. Watch Jack Campbell. All of that felt real. First round pick. That is not just catching guys, right? There is a way, right, that sometimes it's Raekwon McMillan, foundational dude. Shared at the time as a freshman, and then sophomore and junior led the team in tackles. Great player. Sometimes you can feel like tackles don't matter, and sometimes you look at tackle leaders and it's like, oh yeah, no, that guy was awesome. And maybe that's where we are with Tommy Eichenberg. Then again, okay, we're not talking AJ Hawk, James Laurinaitis, Chris Spielman, Randy Gradishar. But maybe we're talking Raekwon McMillan. Maybe we're talking Raekwon. Raekwon doesn't have a tree, was mad. I thought he should have had one. He was never first-team All-American. Kind of got squeezed a little bit in the end, I think, by the expectations that he created for himself. And then it's like, oh, well, the team didn't quite live up to expectations in 15 and 16. Doesn't get a tree. Second-team All-American, Tommy Eichenberg is second-team All-American. When I say that, Stephen, when I say, right, that, okay, maybe not first tier, Raekwon McMillan is still a high bar. And maybe that's what we're talking about if Tommy Eichenberg is able to be a two-time leader in tackles, just like Raekwon McMillan was.
It's when when you look at the stats in the box score at the end of the year, you keep saying the term real when those tackles. It's like you remember those tackles. It felt like you could feel them. Those tackles represent the fact that he was everywhere making plays on his own, which is why I'm glad that a lot of these places, they differentiate assisted tackles and solo tackles, because those solo tackles, that's about you being a playmaker. And since this is the Tommy Eichenberg, apparently, Tommy Eichenberg got 77 solo tackles last year. That would have been tied for first on the team. So it's not just sometimes when you just have assistant tackles, that's just you playing a position where you're always around the ball. So fine, you get a lot of assistant tackles. Like Ronnie Hickman had 53 tackles, 27 of them were assisted, and 26 of them were solo. So that's just, it comes with the job that he gets tackles. The fact that Tommy Eichenberg has 30 more solo tackles than everybody else on the team, and if you take away all of his assistant tackles, he still would have led this team in tackles. That's what makes it Raekwon McMillan. That's what makes it the level right under Ryan Shazier, where that's what makes that point out to me, where you go, maybe he's a second-team All-American again this year, so he never gets the tree, and then Doug's mad that another guy who probably deserved a tree isn't going to get one because of a technicality.
All right, quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about some other guys who aren't Tommy Eichenberg next after this.